Welcome, all brothers and sisters in Christ, to Soulful Scriptures every day.
It is really great to be here with you today.
Yeah, we have a really fascinating deep dive lined up. So imagine for a second that you have spent the last decade or, maybe even 2 or 3 decades just meticulously building your life based on this highly specific map.
Right, you're following all the rules.
Exactly. You followed all the directions, you took all the right turns, and you memorized the landmarks. But then one day you find yourself completely lost in a dense, dark forest.
Oh, that is a terrifying feeling.
It really is. You're disoriented, you're exhausted, and it's in that exact moment of panic that you look down and you realize the map you were given was printed upside down.
Wow.
Yeah. The rules you were playing by, well, they were never the actual rules of the terrain to begin with.
And that realization, I mean, it's just profoundly disorienting. Yeah. But as we're going to explore today, it's perhaps the most necessary realization a human being can have if they actually want to build any kind of lasting resilience.
Absolutely. So I want to set the stage for you listening right now. We live in an era that completely, just totally idolizes optimization.
Oh, without a doubt.
Right. We have biohacking for our bodies. We have these productivity apps to streamline our work down to the microsecond.
And step morning routines, all of that.
Yes. Routines that promise to, instantly revolutionize your life. And the underlying psychological premise of all this is immediacy.
It's that belief in instant gratification.
Exactly. Instant gratification, instant transformation. And here's the core issue with that. That expectation that human biology and psychology can just be hacked for immediate results, it has deeply infiltrated our spiritual and emotional lives.
It really has. We've basically imported the logic of Silicon Valley and consumer capitalism directly into the realm of the human soul.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
We expect our internal growth to operate with the precision of a software update. You download the new operating system, you restart the device, and all the bugs in your character are suddenly just patched.
But the human soul is definitely not a piece of software.
Not at all.
Which brings us to today's mission. We are unpacking an incredibly candid, heavily researched article from the Christian Post. It's written by Leah Marianne Klett.
It's a fantastic piece.
It is. And the focus of this piece is Matt Chandler. He's the 51-year-old pastor of the Village Church in Flower Mound, Texas.
Right.
And we're looking specifically at the concepts he outlines in his upcoming book, which releases April 28th, by the way. It's titled Becoming Like Jesus, The Everyday Journey to Living a Life of Holiness.
And Chandler is drawing on over 30 years of pastoral ministry here. He is stepping up to make a highly countercultural case about human growth and spiritual formation.
Yeah, he's not just doing this as some, theoretical exercise.
No, not at all. He's essentially acting as a physician.
Mm-hmm.
He's looking at a generation of people who are completely burned out, deeply cynical, and just overwhelmingly anxious.
Right.
And he's trying to trace that pathology back to its root. He's basically asking, why is everyone so miserable when they're trying so hard to be good?
Okay, so let's unpack this. Why are we also convinced that personal and spiritual growth is supposed to be the straight, easy line upward?
That's the big question.
Right. And more importantly, what happens to our minds, our identities, and our faith when we inevitably hit a massive wall? Because, no matter how optimized you are going to hit that wall eventually.
You absolutely will. And that assumption, that expectation of the straight line, is the primary illusion that Chandler is targeting in this new work.
He goes right after it.
He really does.
Mm-hmm.
He points out that there's this pervasive, deeply embedded assumption among believers that sanctification just moves linearly.
And just for context, sanctification is just the theological term for the process of spiritual growth, right? Becoming holy.
Exactly. Chandler literally calls this the up and to the right trajectory.
Up and to the right. I love that phrasing because it sounds like a perfect corporate earnings report.
Right. Or a beautifully manipulated stock chart that the board of directors wants to see at the end of the year.
Yes. The assumption is that once you commit to this path, once you say yes to a life of faith, your struggles are just going to systematically vanish.
Like magic.
Yeah, the narrative is that you'll conquer your bad habits, your fractured relationships will smoothly iron themselves out, and you'll never feel existentially disoriented again.
You'll just get better and stronger and more peaceful day by day in this strictly measurable, visible way.
But Chandler steps in and says, look around, look at your life, look at history. That is just not how human beings actually work.
It's fundamentally flawed.
Instead of a straight line, Chandler describes actual durable growth as something very different. He calls it a winding coil.
The winding coil.
Yeah.
It is such a vital image to hold on to because it fundamentally changes the geometry of how we evaluate our own lives.
Right, let's visualize this for a second. A coil, like a spring or a spiral staircase, it goes around and around.
Yeah.
And it's characterized by these distinct, inescapable highs and lows.
You can't have the coil without the loops.
Exactly. So you can be in the upward swing of that coil, feeling fantastic, feeling like you've conquered your demons, completely connected to your purpose.
But then, suddenly, the rotation continues.
Yeah, and you are on the downward loop. You feel depressed, you fall back into an old habit, or you just feel completely disconnected.
And this is where the crisis happens. Because if your mental model is that up and to the right straight line, then hitting that downward loop doesn't just feel like a bad day.
Feels like the whole thing is broken.
It feels like a catastrophic failure of the entire system. It feels like empirical proof that you are broken or that the faith you profess is just a lie.
But if you understand the geometry of the winding coil, your perspective completely shifts. Like, think about the stock market.
Okay. Yeah.
People expect spiritual growth to look like this perfectly manipulated chart that only goes up. But in reality, it looks like a volatile long-term investment.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. There are crashes, there are major corrections, there are bear markets where everything feels like it's bleeding. But if you zoom out far enough on that chart, the overall trajectory is forward.
What's really fascinating here is the underlying psychology behind our absolute desperation for that straight line narrative.
Why do we want it so badly?
Because the human brain is an incredibly sophisticated prediction machine. It is hardwired to crave predictable cause and effect relationships. It's literally how we survive.
So we want a clean transaction.
Exactly. We want to believe if I do X, then Y will happen. If I do good things, if I pray every morning, if I follow the moral rules, then I will get better and my life will be insulated from tragedy.
We basically want a vending machine. I put in my good behavior coins, I press the button, and out pops a stable, happy life.
Precisely. We crave the vending machine because it gives us a profound sense of control in a universe that is fundamentally unpredictable.
Right.
But when the reality of human existence turns out to be a winding coil, when bad things happen to good people, or old addictions flare up after years of sobriety, it causes immense cognitive dissonance.
The brain just can't reconcile the transactional expectation with the chaotic reality.
It short circuits.
Yeah.
And this is where Chandler's motivation for the book becomes so clear. The sources note that he spent decades pastoring people, watching them hit this exact wall.
Yeah, he wrote this specifically to be an honest book.
Because the lack of honesty about this reality is actively hurting people.
It really is. It's creating an entire generation of people who think they are spiritual failures simply because they are human.
Chandler is arguing that the downward loop of the coil is not an anomaly. It's not a glitch in the system. It is a designed part of the architecture of growth.
Wow. So the downward loop is actually doing something?
Yes. The seasons of disorientation are where the deepest root systems are formed. But if we're continually told that we should only ever be moving up and to the right, we'll panic and abandon the process the second things get dark.
Which brings me directly to you, listening right now. Think about your own life, your own career, your relationships.
It applies to everything.
How often have you felt like you were completely failing, entirely back at square one, simply because you were in the downward loop of that coil?
Probably more often than we'd like to admit.
Right. How much unnecessary shame have you carried because you didn't realize that the downward loop, that feeling of walking in the dark, is actually an integral part of the forward motion?
That realization, or honestly the lack of it, is the exact pivot point into the next major concept Chandler addresses.
Let's get into it.
Because when people are sold the up and to the right myth, and they inevitably experience the downward loop, the resulting cognitive dissonance doesn't just make them sad.
No, it leads directly to a much bigger cultural shift.
It leads directly to one of the most prominent, heavily discussed phenomena in the modern cultural landscape, particularly within the church. And that is the process of deconstruction.
Yes, deconstruction. I mean, if you spent any time on the internet, on social media, or reading cultural think pieces over the last 5 years, you have seen this word everywhere.
It's unavoidable.
Chandler pays very close attention to this movement, but he uses a brilliant phrase to describe it. He calls deconstruction a junk drawer word.
It is a phenomenal descriptor. Think about a junk drawer in your kitchen. It holds 100 completely unrelated things.
Batteries, rubber bands, old receipts, a random screwdriver.
Right. They don't belong to a single category, but they all get thrown into the exact same place. And the term deconstruction operates the same way in our cultural lexicon.
It's broad, it's incredibly imprecise, and we just throw a massive variety of different human experiences right into it.
But Chandler also says that despite being a junk drawer word, it is incredibly revealing if you actually take the time to unpack what is inside that drawer.
And he's very careful and highly nuanced in how he approaches this, right? He doesn't just dismiss deconstruction outright as some kind of modern rebellion.
Not at all. He explicitly notes that there are incredibly healthy versions of it. For instance, he talks about the necessity of individuals, particularly young adults, needing to dismantle the inherited faith of their parents in order to truly own it for themselves.
Right. It's the difference between driving a car your parents bought you and actually learning how to build an engine yourself.
That's a great way to look at it.
You have to take the engine apart piece by piece, questioning why this belt goes here, why this spark plug does that. That's necessary.
You have to see how it works so you can put it back together in a way that actually functions for you on the road.
Exactly. That is a completely healthy process of maturation.
But Chandler observes that while that healthy maturation exists, the most common thread he sees inside the deconstruction junk drawer, the really heartbreaking, pervasive thread, is not intellectual curiosity.
What is it?
It is deep, profound disappointment.
Disappointment.
Yes. It's the crushing disappointment that occurs when a person's faith does not insulate them from suffering or when it fails to remove a persistent struggle.
So they hit the downward loop.
Exactly. Chandler points out that he reads countless testimonies from people walking away from their faith. And when you strip away the academic jargon, the core sentiment usually boils down to a single devastating phrase. I tried Jesus. He didn't work.
He didn't work. Wow. I just want to pause and sit with that phrasing for a second because it is so incredibly telling.
It reveals everything about the underlying mental model. If someone says it didn't work, they're explicitly revealing a deeply transactional, consumerist view of religion.
Right, because you don't say a relationship didn't work in the same way you say a toaster didn't work.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? Are we treating faith, are we treating the deepest questions of meaning and existence like a consumer product?
It seems like
Like, I bought this spiritual vacuum cleaner, I plugged it in, it didn't pick up the messy dirt in my life the way the infomercial promised, so I'm boxing it back up, returning it to the store, and leaving a scathing 1-star review online.
That is precisely the consumer trap. And Chandler notes that if you get into the granular nuance of these deconstruction stories, you usually find a profoundly painful human experience beneath the surface.
It's not usually just a theological debate.
No, usually life just didn't go their way. A super disorienting trauma occurred, a divorce, a death, a severe financial collapse, or a persistent psychological fight with a specific temptation just wouldn't magically disappear.
And because they were only ever taught the straight upward line, they interpret this persistence of struggle not as a normal part of the human condition, but as empirical proof that the product is defective.
They conclude the system doesn't work. And Chandler acutely observes that people in this situation often frame their disappointment using the modern language of trauma.
Right.
They adopt clinical psychological terms to describe the pain of unmet, unrealistic expectations.
This connects directly to a highly provocative question. Chandler asks people who are in the middle of this specific type of disappointment. He asks, what version of the gospel did you receive?
Such an important question.
Because if the version you received was a consumer promise, the promise that giving your soul to a belief system means everything will logically go your way, then yes, you absolutely received a faulty counterfeit product.
And you have every right to be angry about being sold a bill of goods.
Exactly. But Chandler's core theological argument is that this consumer promise is not the actual historical gospel.
Right. The true promise isn't a problem-free, friction-free life.
The true promise, according to his synthesis of the texts, is presence. It's the assurance of God's presence in the midst of the inevitable friction.
It's the promise that regardless of what horrifying chaos enters your life, the divine will be intimately with you.
And this is the absolute kicker here. He says God won't waste it. He won't waste the suffering.
He won't waste it. That is a profound tectonic paradigm shift. It completely moves the entire concept of faith out of the realm of behavior modification and consumerism and transplants it into the realm of enduring relationship.
But I want to push back here, or, at least play devil's advocate for a moment. Yeah. Because it is very easy for a guy who sells books and speaks on stages to talk about how suffering is never wasted, and how it builds character.
It can sound like toxic positivity.
Exactly. It can sound like a cheap bumper sticker that you just slap on someone's tragedy.
And if it were just theoretical, it absolutely would be toxic positivity. But the sources are incredibly clear that for Chandler, this theology is not an abstraction constructed in an ivory tower.
No, it really isn't.
His framework for suffering has been forged in an unimaginably intense personal crucible.
Yeah, let's look at the actual reality of his life, because you really cannot separate Chandler's message from his lived experience.
You have to know his story to understand his theology.
The article details his intense, prolonged battle with brain cancer. We are talking about years of terrifying diagnoses, grueling treatments, and facing his own mortality while trying to raise young children.
Horrific.
He also speaks openly about deep, grinding, early struggles in his marriage. He mentions recent severe health crises that have hospitalized both him and his wife.
He describes having 3 or 4 distinct, terrifying moments in his life where, in his exact words, the floor fell out from under me.
He is intimately acquainted with what is historically known in spiritual literature as the dark night of the soul.
Yes, that concept traces back to the 16th century mystic St. John of the Cross. It describes a period of profound spiritual desolation, a sense of total abandonment, and a collapse of all previously held certainties.
It is the absolute bottom of the downward loop on that winding coil.
And Chandler's argument, which is just staggering when you consider what he has lived through, is that the most profound structural shaping of his soul did not happen when he was winning.
Right. The growth didn't happen when his church was exploding in attendance or when his books were hitting bestseller lists.
The profound, indestructible shaping happened exclusively when he was completely disoriented, when the floor vanished, when the cancer diagnosis came.
He is fundamentally reframing the mechanism of suffering. In the consumer mindset, suffering is a roadblock.
Right. It's an obstacle preventing you from reaching your optimized life.
But Chandler is asserting that suffering is not the obstacle to your spiritual formation. It is the primary instrument of it.
It is the only fire hot enough to burn away the transactional consumerism and leave behind genuine resilience.
Okay, wait. I have to stop you there, because if someone is listening to this right now and they have just lost their job, or they're going through a brutal divorce, or they just buried a loved one.
He is heavy.
Hearing someone call their profound trauma an instrument for growth sounds incredibly dismissive. It almost sounds cruel. How does Chandler reconcile this overarching theology with the visceral, bleeding reality of human grief? Does he just offer them a theological platitude?
This is where Chandler's pastoral experience truly shows its weight. He does not offer platitudes. To his immense credit, Chandler readily admits that this framework is a remarkably hard pill to swallow.
He doesn't sugarcoat it.
No. He acknowledges that looking a grieving person in the eye and telling them your suffering is an instrument is often completely unsatisfying. In fact, he admits it can feel deeply offensive in the face of profound, senseless, real-world loss.
And he gives this incredibly raw, breathtakingly honest quote in the article. He's talking about the limits of his own ability to explain pain, and he says, "I still have no good answer for you on the death of a 6-year-old."
That is a staggering admission from a prominent religious leader.
It really is. He's outright saying he cannot intellectually make sense of how something that horrific, that intrinsically wrong, is going to somehow glorify God one day.
He refuses to put a neat little theological bow on the death of a child.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what Chandler is modeling here is the immense radical humility required to hold tension.
Because in our modern culture, we demand immediate explanations for everything.
Right. If a tragedy happens, we need a think piece, a documentary, and a definitive psychological explanation published within 48 hours.
But Chandler is suggesting that to survive the winding coil, you must develop the capacity to hold the unanswerable tension. You have to admit that not all suffering makes logical causal sense in the moment. We do not have the omniscient blueprint.
But then what is the survival mechanism? If you're in the dark and there are no easy answers, what do you actually do?
Chandler offers an ultimate encouragement in the face of this unanswerable pain, and it's shockingly simple. He says, if you don't quit, you win.
If you don't quit, you win.
It strips away the demand for perfect understanding. The goal, when you're in the dark night of the soul, is not to intellectually decode exactly why it is happening. The goal is endurance.
The goal is to let the disorienting season accomplish its subterranean work, rather than frantically trying to medicate it or run away from it or solve it.
Exactly. The purpose of the dark night is to close the distance between you and the divine, not to provide you with a satisfying syllabus of your life's meaning.
But practically speaking, how do you actually do that? If you're trapped in a deeply disorienting season, if you're stuck at the bottom of the downward loop, how do you survive the friction without quitting?
Chandler doesn't just leave us with abstract theology. He points to very specific, highly actionable, sustaining practices. And the primary one he highlights is a tool that I think is radically misunderstood in our modern context.
And what's that?
The practice of confession.
Yes, confession. When the modern secular mind, or honestly even modern churchgoer, hears the word confession, they immediately envision a highly formalized, rigid, often shame-inducing process.
Right. We picture a dark wooden booth, a list of terrible crimes, and a transactional exchange of penance for absolution. It feels heavy and legalistic.
Or we think of a tearful, scandalous press conference where a politician admits to embezzlement. It's associated with catastrophic failure.
But Chandler completely strips the word of all that cultural baggage. He redefines confession with profound simplicity. He calls it just telling God the truth.
Just telling the truth. The psychological relief embedded in that redefinition is enormous, because the truth he's talking about isn't just a ledger of moral infractions.
Crucially, that truth includes all the messy, contradictory things we are usually taught to aggressively hide.
It includes crushing doubt. It includes white-hot anger at the universe. It includes deep, paralyzing confusion.
These are the exact emotions that are so often suppressed in modern, highly polished church settings where everyone is expected to smile and say they're blessed.
But Chandler points out that this suppression is actually a modern invention. The suppression of negative emotion is entirely unbiblical.
He directs our attention back to the primary source texts. He looks at figures like King David, who authored many of the Psalms, or the prophet Jeremiah.
If you read their writings, they're brutally, shockingly honest with God.
They express deep despair, they question God's fairness, they literally scream into the void. They didn't polish their emotions before presenting them. Their confession was a raw data dump of their psychological state.
And we have a very public, very highly scrutinized example of how Chandler views this mechanism of confession and transparency in his own life. We really have to talk about the events of 2022.
Yes, because this is where the rubber meets the road regarding institutional vulnerability.
In the fall of 2022, Chandler took a temporary leave of absence from his role as the lead pastor of the village church. And this was not a minor event. It made national news.
The reason given was an online messaging relationship with a woman who was not his wife. Now, the sources are absolutely explicit, and the independent reviews confirmed that this relationship was entirely non-romantic and non-sexual.
Right. It wasn't an affair. But the church elders who reviewed this situation described the frequency and familiarity of the messaging as unguarded and unwise.
It crossed a boundary of propriety for someone in his position.
Now let's analyze this from a sociological and institutional perspective. In 99% of corporate, political, or large-scale religious institutional settings, the immediate instinct of the leadership board would be aggressive damage control.
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah.
The playbook is cover it up, manage the PR, handle it internally behind closed doors. Or, have the leader quietly transition to a new role to protect the brand equity of the organization.
The instinct is to keep that shiny up into the right narrative intact at all costs. Because if the leader admits a flaw, the consumers might lose faith in the product.
Precisely. But the approach taken by Chandler and his elders was radical public transparency. Chandler stood before his congregation and confessed the unwise behavior openly.
He spoke about the process, noting that when he stumbled, he was met with what he called both grace and accountability.
He didn't hide, but he also didn't escape consequence. He stepped away, submitted to a restoration process, and did the internal work.
And the result of that public confession, the actual impact of that institutional transparency, was fascinating. From a PR perspective, you'd assume admitting weakness would destroy the church's credibility.
But it didn't.
No. Chandler noted that this very public failure and the transparent handling of it actually deeply strengthened the culture of trust within the congregation.
It is a stunning paradox of human psychology. We assume that perfection builds trust. But perfection actually builds defensive walls. When an institution projects an image of invulnerability, the individuals within that institution feel an immense pressure to hide their own vulnerabilities.
Yes. Because if I think the leader is perfect, and I know I'm struggling with an addiction or my marriage is falling apart, I feel like I don't belong, so I hide my struggle just to blend in.
But when the leader stands up and publicly admits a flaw, when they model honest confession, It fundamentally alters the neurological environment of the community. It removes the congregation's cognitive burden of having to pretend.
Chandler observed that his public confession acted as a catalyst. It gave permission, and it encouraged other people in the church to confess their own struggles, their own addictions, much more quickly, rather than letting those issues fester in the dark.
There is such a profound, beautiful irony at the core of this. Our survival instinct tells us that admitting a flaw or admitting deep doubt creates distance.
We think it makes us unlovable. We think it pushes God away, or it pushes our community away because we're no longer perfect. So we hide, we curate our image.
But Chandler argues the exact opposite is true regarding the mechanics of relationship. Trying to hide the doubt or the sin is what actually creates the distance. You're holding up a shield.
Bringing the raw doubt, the messy reality, right into the completely exposed light, that vulnerability is the only mechanism that can actually draw you closer.
It's the fundamental difference between managing an image and pursuing an actual relationship. You cannot have a genuine, transformative relationship if you're constantly forcing the other party to interact with a highly curated, fake version of yourself.
True intimacy requires the exposure of the unpolished self.
Which provides us with the perfect logical bridge into how Chandler views our interactions with the world around us. Because if this radical honesty and exposure is essential internally, that exact same honesty must be applied externally in our relationships with others.
Right. You can't be honest with God and then lie to your neighbor to avoid friction.
Exactly. The internal posture must dictate the external practice. And this leads us to a really sharp, incredibly necessary distinction Chandler makes regarding how we handle conflict.
He draws a massive line between two words that sound very similar, but are functionally worlds apart.
Peacemaking and peacekeeping.
Peacekeeping versus peacemaking. Let's break down the mechanics of these two approaches.
Chandler explains that peacekeeping is essentially a passive endeavor. It is fundamentally rooted in conflict avoidance and anxiety management.
It's the act of seeing an issue, seeing a deep division or a relational fracture, and actively choosing to stay quiet so you don't rock the boat.
It is the prioritization of artificial surface-level harmony over actual structural integrity. You keep the peace by allowing the toxic issues to fester quietly under the surface.
Let me give you an analogy for this because I think it perfectly illustrates the hidden danger. Think about driving your car down the highway and suddenly your check engine light illuminates bright red on your dashboard. You have a choice. Peacekeeping is taking a piece of black electrical tape and just sticking it right over the light. You don't have to look at the warning anymore. Your immediate anxiety goes down. The cabin of the car feels peaceful again.
But underneath the hood, the engine is quietly tearing itself apart. The oil is leaking, the timing belt is fraying. You have artificial peace, but you are heading for a catastrophic breakdown.
Exactly.
That is a phenomenal way to conceptualize it, because the tape over the light relieves the immediate friction, but it guarantees ultimate destruction.
Right. Now, peacemaking, on the other hand, is awful in the short term. Peacemaking is active. It means pulling the car over on the side of a busy, loud highway.
It means opening the hood.
Getting your hands covered in grease, burning your knuckles on the engine block while you try to fix the snapped belt. It hurts, it causes massive friction, it delays your trip, but it is the only way the vehicle actually survives the journey.
Peacemaking requires stepping into the conflict, addressing the uncomfortable truth head-on, and doing the grueling, painful work of finding true resolution.
Chandler warns that in our current cultural climate, both inside and outside the church, we heavily prefer the black tape. We prefer peacekeeping.
And because we don't want to say anything uncomfortable, because we lack the courage to face the heat of the engine block, issues that should just be a minor relational skirmish are left to fester.
The resentment builds in the dark until it inevitably explodes into a full-blown war.
And if we extrapolate this mechanism, it applies so powerfully, so viscerally to our modern cultural and political divisions. Look at the landscape.
We are living in a historical moment marked by intense, hyper-reactive polarization. We exist in echo chambers where we only interact with people who agree with us, which is the ultimate form of societal peacekeeping.
We are terrified of the friction of genuine disagreement.
But true belonging in any community cannot exist without friction. Chandler is arguing that if a community is just keeping the peace, the relationships are entirely superficial. They're contingent on nobody ever stepping out of line.
Real, durable belonging demands the vulnerability of honest conflict, the messy process of arguing, and the commitment to stay in the room until resolution is reached.
And Chandler really scales up his critique at this point in the material. He zooms out from individual relationships to look at the macro level of the institution.
He argues that this systemic failure of peacemaking, combined with that deep desire for a transactional consumer-style faith we unpacked earlier, has culminated in a massive, devastating cultural drift within the broader American church.
He's basically diagnosing a systemic illness, and I want to pause here and explicitly state for the listener, we are analyzing Chandler's critique of the environment here. We are not endorsing any specific political side, left or right.
Absolutely. We're just reporting on the source material. Chandler observes that the deep entanglement of faith with specific political ideologies is, in his exact word, killing us.
He sees it as highly subversive to the core message. It replaces the difficult, unifying work of spiritual formation with the cheap, divisive tribalism of partisan politics.
He makes a very bold prediction here. He states that in 10 to 15 years, when the dust settles, the church will look back on its current era of political entanglement with deep embarrassment and shame. It will be viewed as a historical failure of focus.
This raises an important question, perhaps the most important sociological question of the deep dive. How did we get here?
How did an institution founded on radical grace and peacemaking drift into rigid, angry political tribalism?
Right. Chandler doesn't just blame the present algorithm or current political leaders. He traces the roots of these modern challenges back to inherited structural distortions that really solidified in the 1990s.
The 1990s. He points to that decade, which many people remember nostalgically as a time of peace and economic boom, as a disaster in a lot of ways for spiritual formation.
He specifically calls out two overarching frameworks that gained massive, unchecked traction during that era: the prosperity gospel and moralistic therapeutic deism.
Let's unpack the sociology of why those specific frameworks thrived in that specific decade. The 1990s in America, post-Cold War, were defined by unprecedented economic prosperity, suburban expansion, and a general sense of historical safety.
In that environment of comfort, a massive shift occurred in how faith was packaged and consumed.
The prosperity gospel is the ultimate manifestation of that consumer era. It's essentially the transactional faith we mentioned earlier, taken to its logical extreme.
The core tenet is that faith is a tool for material advancement. If you believe hard enough, and usually if you donate enough money to the preacher, God is obligated to reward you with financial wealth and physical health.
It literally turns God into a cosmic stockbroker.
And alongside that, you have the rise of what sociologists Christian Smith and Alinda Lundquist-Denton famously termed moralistic therapeutic deism, or MTD.
This is the exact framework Chandler is critiquing. MTD is the idea that God exists, but he isn't particularly involved in your daily life unless you have a problem you need him to solve.
His primary demand is just that you be a good, nice person and follow the basic rules of society.
It reduces the entirely radical, life-altering, ego-destroying reality of the Christian faith down to simple behavior modification and anxiety management.
It's suburban etiquette wrapped in a thin veneer of theology.
Exactly. And Chandler notes that every generation inherits something broken from the generation before it, and they have to do the hard work of reforming it. He says, the history of the church is that we drift.
This is actually a well-documented sociological phenomenon. The sociologist Max Weber talked about the routinization of charisma.
All dynamic movements, all institutions start with a core, relational, fiery founding vision. But over time, as they grow, they inevitably drift. They institutionalize.
They shift from fostering a dynamic spirit to simply maintaining behavioral management systems and preserving their own power structures.
So the people who grew up in the 90s youth groups were handed this incredibly shallow behavioral consumerist version of faith. And when they became adults and they hit the downward loop of the winding coil when the cancer hit or the divorce happened or the political landscape fractured, that shallow faith completely collapsed.
Because a theology based on suburban etiquette cannot survive the dark night of the soul.
Chandler believes the current generation, the ones deconstructing, are actually attempting to rewrite and heal that specific localized damage from the 90s. They're desperately looking for something real.
So the ultimate question becomes, how do we build something real? If we are trying to heal that generational damage, if we're trying to survive the terrifying winding coil of our own internal growth.
And resist the gravitational pull of transactional consumerism.
Right, and navigate this incredibly loud, politically fractured, outrage-driven modern world without losing our souls. What is the mechanism?
Chandler suggests that the antidote is the recovery of a forgotten, heavily maligned virtue.
And that virtue is meekness.
Meekness. It is a word that requires immediate rehabilitation because it has incredibly bad PR in our current cultural lexicon.
Terrible PR. If you call someone meek today, it is an insult. In a culture that universally rewards absolute certainty, maximum volume, aggressive self-promotion, and the ability to completely destroy your opponents online, meekness is almost always dismissed as pathetic weakness.
You're seen as a pushover, a doormat, someone who lacks the spine to fight back.
But Chandler dives into the historical and theological roots of the word, and he completely redefines it for the modern age. He calls meekness strength under control.
Strength under control. Let's look at the etymology. The ancient Greek word often translated as meek is praus. In antiquity, this word was heavily associated with the taming of wild horses, particularly war horses.
A wild stallion is incredibly powerful, but it's chaotic and useless in battle.
When that horse is broken and trained, it loses none of its raw muscular power, but that power is now completely responsive to the gentle touch of the rider's reins. That is praus.
It is immense power that has been intentionally harnessed. It's not the absence of power. It is the absolute intentional restraint of power.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I want you to contrast that ancient definition with the reality of modern internet culture.
Think about the performative outrage we witness and often participate in every single day. The algorithms of social media are literally designed to reward explosive reactivity.
Someone posts something offensive or a political opponent makes a mistake, and the immediate culturally celebrated reaction is to blast them, to quote tweet them, to exude all your rhetorical power to humiliate and tear them down in front of an audience.
We view that explosive, unhinged reaction as strength. We applaud it.
But if we apply Chandler's framework, that explosive reaction is not strength. It is a lack of control. It is the wild stallion panicking.
Exactly. Now imagine the immense, terrifying internal strength required to not react to every provocation. Imagine having the rhetorical power, the evidence, and the platform to completely destroy someone who has wronged you, and actively choosing to hold the reins tight.
Actively choosing restraint. Choosing to absorb the blow without returning fire, not because you are weak, but because you are playing a much longer, much deeper game.
That is weakness. It takes exponentially more psychological and spiritual strength to hold back than it does to lash out.
It does. And adopting that posture of meekness, that willingness to not have everything resolved immediately, brings us right back to the winding coil we started with.
Because the coil is a long game. For those listening who are deeply discouraged by their painfully slow progress, who feel the crushing pressure of a culture that demands instant perfection and absolute certainty, Chandler offers a profound, almost startling comfort.
He reminds us that the divine is neither frustrated nor surprised by your slow pace.
He writes, "You are a work in progress from the moment you begin until the end." Let that sink in. You are not supposed to be finished yet. That realization is such a massive relief.
It is the ultimate antidote to the optimization culture. Chandler's concluding thought in the article is incredibly powerful and synthesizing. He says, Jesus knew what he was buying on the cross.
Think about the immense psychological and emotional relief that specific phrasing offers. The pressure of achieving immediate linear perfection is completely removed.
It's replaced by the expansive grace of a long, uneven, messy journey. The divine knew exactly how flawed, how prone to drifting, and how slow to learn human beings are, and opted into the relationship anyway.
You don't have to be perfectly optimized tomorrow. You just have to stay on the coil.
Let's bring this whole massive journey together. We started by dismantling the toxic myth that human growth is up and to the right, replacing it with the realistic, forgiving geometry of the winding coil.
We examined how the consumer expectation of a pain-free life leads directly to the junk drawer of deconstruction. We confronted the terrifying reality of the dark night of the soul, recognizing it not as an obstacle, but as the crucible where our deepest resilience is forged.
We unpacked the counterintuitive power of brutally honest confession, realizing that transparency builds trust while hiding destroys it. We explored the painful, necessary work of active peacemaking instead of passive peacekeeping.
We traced our current cultural outrage back to the transactional behavior modification faith of the 1990s. And finally, we saw how true, durable strength in a deafeningly loud world doesn't look like explosive outrage. It looks like meekness. It looks like a warhorse under control.
It is a remarkably comprehensive framework for human resilience. It fundamentally changes the diagnostic lens through which you view every setback, every failure and every conflict in your life.
It really does. And to you listening right now, whether you're prepping for a corporate board meeting, trying to analyze vast sociological shifts, navigating a crisis in your family, or you are just insanely curious about the mechanics of human resilience, Chandler's framework gives you permission to view your life differently.
Those moments where you feel like you are failing, where you feel like you are walking in the dark and making no progress, they are not systemic failures.
They are simply the downward loops of a coil that is, ultimately, despite the nausea of the ride, still moving forward.
The diagnostic landscape might be incredibly murky, but the long, slow work of healing is still happening.
Exactly. So I want to leave you with a final, slightly provocative thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your week. We spent a lot of time talking about how the dark night of the soul, the deepest downward loop, is where the most profound structural shaping of your character actually happens.
The crucible.
I want you to look at the most frustrating, disorienting, painful downward loop in your life right this exact second. The conflict you avoid, the habit you can't break, the grief you just wish would magically disappear. If you were guaranteed, absolutely guaranteed, that this exact agonizing struggle was the primary instrument intentionally designed to build your future strength, how would you treat that struggle tomorrow morning?
That is a question worth sitting with.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.